The sun is setting over 17th century New England. The year is 1675 and the skies above the forests and villages are painted with hues of orange and purple. It's a beautiful summer evening, warm and still, the kind of day that feels like it should last forever. But as the light fades and the first stars begin to appear, the tranquility of the scene does too. For beneath this peaceful veneer, tensions are quietly building that will soon explode into one of the most brutal conflicts in American history. Welcome to Twilight over New England, a soft opening. I'm your host. And before we dive into today's episode, I want to give a quick shout out to our supporters who make these videos possible. Be sure to check them out and join our community today. Now let's get started. As twilight settles over the New England countryside, the people are beginning to settle in for the night. Families are gathered around their colonial homes, sharing stories and laughter as they prepare for bed. The sounds of crickets and whippoorwills fill the air, creating a soothing melody that lulls many into a false sense of security. It's a perfect summer evening, or so it seems. In reality, the tranquility of the twilight hours is only an illusion, for beneath the surface, a storm is brewing. Metacom, also known to the colonists as King Philip, is preparing his forces for a final assault. The stage is set for a conflict that will leave a lasting impact on the region and the nation as a whole. Take a moment to imagine yourself here in this New England village at the close of the 17th century. The scent of salt marsh and pine hangs heavy in the air, mingling with the sounds of church bells and the distant call of a whip. You can hear the murmur of conversation as neighbors exchange news of the day, their voices carrying on the gentle breeze. Laughter of children at play echoes through the streets, creating a sense of community and togetherness. The flickering light of oil lamp illuminates the faces of families gathered at their dinner tables, sharing a meal in each other's company. The warmth of the hearth creates a comforting glow, inviting you to pull up a chair and join in on their stories and laughter. As the night deepens, the atmosphere takes on a different tone. The playful chatter of children is replaced by the hushed whispers of adults discussing the latest news from the frontier. Stories of Native American raids and the growing unrest among the colonists fill the air, creating a sense of unease and uncertainty about the future. The shadows cast by the flickering candlelight seem to dance on the walls, taking on menacing forms that feed into the growing paranoia. As the night wears on, the villagers retreat to the safety of their homes, locking their doors and drawing their shutters tight against the darkness. The silence of the night is broken only by the sound of crickets and the distant howl of an owl, creating an eerie atmosphere that makes it easy to believe that danger lurks around every corner. Now, if you find yourself drawn to these stories of colonial America, I have a special treat for you. A new series, Chronicles of the Covenant, is now available. In this captivating series, ULL be transported back to the early days of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, where ULL meet John Alden, a young man torn between his duty to his colony and his growing love for a Native American woman named Rebecca. As you follow John and his companions on their journey, ULL witness the clash between two cultures and the difficult decisions that must be made in the name of survival and love. To start listening today, visit the website below or click the link in the description. Now let's return to our soft opening. For those unfamiliar with King Philip's War, allow me to provide some context for this brutal conflict. King Philip's War, also known as Metacom's War, was a bloody and significant event in American history. Lasting from 1675 to 1676, this conflict was primarily fought between the colonial settlers of New England and a coalition of Native American tribes led by Metacom, also known as King Philip. The war was a culmination of growing tensions between the two groups over land rights, trade, and cultural differences. The Native Americans felt threatened by the encroachment of the colonists onto their ancestral lands and sought to defend their way of life. However, the colonists, driven by expansionist goals and a desire for more land, continued to push westward, leading to increased conflict. One of the most significant aspects of King Philip's War is its intensity and brutality. Despite the relatively small population of New England at the time, the war resulted in an estimated 20% of the region's inhabitants being killed or captured. Entire villages were wiped out, and atrocities were committed by both sides. The conflict had a profound impact on the demographics of the region, with many colonists and Native Americans being sold into slavery. The aftermath of the war saw the decline of Native American populations in New England and the further displacement of the remaining tribes. King Philip Eswa serves as a reminder of the dark chapters in American history and the devastating consequences of colonization on indigenous populations. Now let us drift into the past and immerse ourselves in the heart of New England during this turbulent time. Picture yourself strolling through a quaint colonial village. As the sun begins its slow descent towards the horizon, the air is filled with the scent of pine and the distant sound of hammering echoes from a nearby workshop. As you wander through the village, you'll notice the architecture reflecting the region's character. The meeting house stands as a testament to the importance of religion in colonial life, its steep roof and simple design reflecting a puritanical approach to worship. Nearby, the Great Hall serves as a hub for community gatherings and political discussions, its large windows offering glimpses into the lively debates taking place within. But amidst this picturesque setting, there's an undercurrent of tension that threatens to disrupt the tranquility. Whispers of discontent carried on the wind, hinting at the growing conflict between the colonists and the Native Americans. Stories of raids and attacks serve as a constant reminder of the dangers that lurk beyond the village borders. The once peaceful streets now seem to echo with the possibility of violence, and the shadow of war looms on the horizon. As twilight deepens, the mood in the village takes a somber turn. The light of the setting sun casts long shadows, creating an eerie atmosphere that amplifies the sense of unease. The blacksmith's hammer falls silent, and the villagers, sensing the weight of the impending conflict, begin to retreat to the safety of their homes. The flickering light of oil lamps provides a momentary comfort, but the darkness that creeps in through the cracks in the walls also brings fear. Inside their homes, the villagers anxiously discuss the latest news, their voices hushed but filled with worry. The war drums of the Native Americans seem to be beating louder now, and the villagers know that the calm of this summer evening may soon be shattered by the chaos of battle. They share stories of bravery and resilience, drawing strength from their community as they prepare for the uncertain hours ahead. And it is during these moments of quiet contemplation that the true depth of the coming conflict begins to reveal itself. The war that has been brewing on the horizon has now arrived, and the villagers must face the harsh realities of what lies ahead. The unity that once defined their community is now put to the ultimate test as they brace for the storm. If you're enjoying this episode and want to support our work, consider becoming a patron. Your support helps us continue producing these immersive, historical experiences. As the first stars begin to twinkle in the darkening sky, the villagers of New England gather close to their fireplaces, seeking solace in the flickering flames. The warmth of the fire reflects in their anxious eyes as they share stories of the day, their voices low and serious. Outside, the wind seems to whisper tales of battles and bloodshed, carrying with it the scent of smoke and a hint of something metallic that lingers at the edge of their senses. They know that the tranquility of this evening is deceptive, for the calm before the storm is never truly calm. With each passing moment, the tension rises, and the villagers feel the weight of the coming conflict pressing down on them like a heavy fog. Their hands tremble slightly as they pass around mugs of cider, their faces illuminated by the firelight, etched with worry and determination. They speak in hushed tones of courage and sacrifice, their words carrying the weight of their ancestors, who had faced their own battles to carve out this life in the New World. But even as they draw strength from their shared history, the uncertainty of the future casts a long shadow over their hopes and dreams. As the night deepens, the fire crackles, sending sparks spiraling upwards towards the darkened ceiling. Each spark seems to dance with the fleeting moments of their lives, reminding them of the preciousness of time and the fragility of their existence. With each gust of wind that rattles the windows, their hearts skip a beat. They listen intently, straining to hear any sound that might carry on the breeze, hoping against hope that it's just the wind playing tricks on their ears. But, deep down, they know that the peace of this evening is a fragile thing, destined to be shattered by the dawn. As the last embers glow in the fireplace, the villagers of New England know that they stand on the precipice of a new day, a day that will change their lives forever. The war that has been looming on the horizon has now arrived, and they must face the uncertainty of what lies ahead, with a mix of courage and trepidation. The coming hours will test their resilience, their faith, and their determination to survive. As the first rays of sunlight peek through the cracks in the wooden shutters, the villagers of New England awaken to a world that has changed. The peaceful morning light does little to penetrate the heavy gloom that has settled over their village. The events of the previous night have cast a long shadow, and they know that the tranquility of their lives has been shattered beyond repair. Some rise slowly, their movements stiff with fatigue and worry, while others jump up with sudden energy, their minds racing with thoughts of escape and survival. The fire in their homes may be cold, but the flames of fear and uncertainty burn brightly in their hearts. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingles with the smell of wood smoke in the air, creating a haunting backdrop to their grim reality. As they step outside, the morning mist clings to the ground, mirroring the heavy feeling in their chests. The dew-laden grass feels cold beneath their feet, a stark reminder of the icy grip that fear has taken on their souls. The birds that once sang merrily in the trees are silent now, their chirping drowned out by the distant rumble of thunder that echoes their own inner turmoil. The sky, once a canvas of endless possibilities, is overcast with dark clouds that mirror the bleak outlook that stretches before them. Each villager is consumed by their own thoughts, their faces drawn and pale as they contemplate the uncertain path ahead. Some clutch their rifles tightly, seeking solace in the cold steel, while others fold their hands in silent prayer, begging for divine intervention. The bonds of community that once united them are now tested as fear and desperation threaten to tear them apart. In the midst of this despair, a sense of unity begins to emerge. They rally together, drawing strength from their shared predicament and the knowledge that they must confront this new day as a community. For even in the darkest hours, the human spirit has an uncanny ability to find light. And so they stand united, ready to face whatever challenges may come their way, knowing that the fate of their village and their very survival hangs in the balance. As the sun finally rises, casting its pale light over the village, the villagers of New England know that they cannot remain in denial any longer. The idyllic charm of their town has been stripped away, revealing the harsh realities of the world they now inhabit. The coming hours will test their resilience, their faith, and their determination to survive. In the heart of New England, the dawn of a new day ushers in a reality that the villagers never anticipated. Their peaceful world has been irrevocably shattered, leaving them on the brink of a perilous journey filled with uncertainty and danger. As they step out of their homes, they are met with the chilling sight of abandoned belongings strewn across the ground, remnants of the haste with which they fled. A child's forgotten toy lies on the dusty path, a silent testament to the innocence lost in the face of adversity. A half-eaten breakfast sits abandoned on a table, a reminder of the normalcy that has been violently disrupted. The once familiar streets now seem like a treacherous labyrinth, every shadow holding the potential for danger. The villagers move with a sense of urgency, their steps echoing their pounding hearts. They exchange nervous glances, their eyes wide with fear and apprehension. The bonds of community that once connected them now tighten as they rely on each other for support and strength. The weight of the coming journey presses down on them, threatening to crush their spirits. They carry with them only what they can, leaving behind the memories and material possessions that define their lives. The thought of losing everything they hold dear hangs over them like a dark cloud, stealing their joy and replacing it with a numbing dread. As they traverse the unfamiliar terrain, they are acutely aware that they are not merely running from danger, but also running for hope, for a chance at a future that remains unwritten. The path ahead is fraught with peril, but their determination to survive and rebuild their lives fuels their every step. So ends our soft opening twilight over New England. If you enjoyed this immersive experience, please consider supporting us. And don't forget to tune in next time for another captivating tale. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring the world's hidden stories. In the decades before the Mayflower arrived in what we today call there lived here the Wampanoag people, who had been living along these shores for thousands of years. They hunted deer and fished the coastal waters. They grew corn and squash and beans, and they lived in a culture that revered nature, seeing it as sacred. The seasons dictated their lives, and the balance of nature was maintained through ceremony and ritual. It was an old way of life that was about to be violently disrupted. Hello, and welcome to this house. Today, we are exploring episode 2, Before the Storm, where we will look at Wampanoag life in the early 1600s and the arrival of the first English settlers in New England. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. The Wampanoag people were one of many tribes that thrived throughout New England, and their name means people of the dawn. Their ancestors had probably arrived in the region about 5,000 years ago and settled along the eastern seaboard from Cape Cod down to Long Island Sound and west to the center of present-day Massachusetts. They lived in small villages composed of several large wigwams, which were domed houses made of wood and covered with thatch. These would serve as communal dwellings during the winter months. But when spring arrived and the weather warmed, the residents would abandon them and move out into the smaller family homes or visit their seasonal camps where they could hunt and fish. Theirs was a culture deeply connected to the rhythms of nature. Seasonal celebrations marked important events such as planting and harvesting time, and the Wampanoag people saw themselves as part of the natural order of things, not superior to animals or plants, but connected to them. The Wampanoag also had a rich spiritual life. They believed that a great spirit, whom they called the Great Man Above, had created the world and everything in it, including the other spirits that dwelled in the natural world, and it was their duty to live in harmony with those spirits. Many of their rituals were designed to maintain the balance of nature, such as the midwinter festival of the New Year, when they celebrated the return of the sun and the promise of spring. They also held ceremonies to ensure successful hunts and bountiful harvests. The Wampanoag worldview was very different from that of the Europeans who would soon arrive on their shores. For the Wampanoag, the land was not something to be owned or exploited, but rather a living, breathing entity to be respected and cared for. Their concept of property was also very different. They did not believe in private ownership of land, but rather saw it as a communal resource to be shared by all members of their society. When the first Europeans arrived in the early 1600s, they would find a people with a sophisticated culture and deep connection to the land, totally at odds with the beliefs and practices of the Old World. And while the first decade or so would see a fragile peace between the two cultures, the stage was set for increasing conflict driven by cultural differences and economic pressures. The year is 1620, and the Mayflower, a small merchant ship carrying 51 passengers and 30 crew members, drops anchor in the chilly waters off the coast of what we today call Cape Cod. This ragtag band of English settlers had fled Europe in search of religious freedom, but they soon find themselves in desperate need of help. Winter was fast approaching, and they were ill-prepared to survive the harsh New England climate. Fortunately for them, the Wampanoag people were willing to lend a hand. Now, why the Wampanoag didn't just chase them away is anyone's guess. They knew these newcomers were different. Their religion was strange, their customs even stranger, and yet they were quick to come to their aid. The fact was, these settlers were weak and dispirited, and the Wampanoag weren't about to take any chances. After all, they'd seen how diseases brought by Europeans ravaged entire Native American populations further south. There was no need to repeat that mistake here. Luckily, a Wampanoag man named Squanto, who had been captured years earlier by an English crew and taken to Europe, had returned home. He understood both cultures and served as a translator between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag leader, Masita. Over the course of that first winter, Squanto taught the settlers how to cultivate the land and assured that they would survive. In the spring, they would celebrate that survival with a feast that has become legendary. Known as the First Thanksgiving, this 3-day event was a gesture of goodwill between the two cultures and a celebration of the Pilgrims' survival. The Wampanoag taught the Pilgrims how to plant corn and gather food, and in return, the Pilgrims shared with them new tools and techniques, and so began a fragile peace between the Wampanoag and the English settlers. Over the next 2 decades, more and more settlers arrived, and the colonies of Massachusetts Bay and Connecticut were established. Despite the growing number of settlers, relations between the Wampanoag and the English remained relatively peaceful. Part of this was due to the leadership of Massasoit, who was able to keep his people from launching a full-scale attack against the English. And part of it was simply because the English were too busy fighting each other to notice the simmering tension among the natives. But beneath the surface, things were changing. As more and more settlers arrived, the pressure on the Wampanoag people to conform to English ways of life increased, and with it, the seeds of discontent were sown. The English colonists brought with them a culture that was very different from that of the Wampanoag. Their religion, for example, was a major point of contention. The Puritans who settled in New England were deeply religious people, who believed that it was their duty to convert the Wampanoag to Christianity. This was not always done in a sensitive manner, however, and the Wampanoag were often ridiculed for their traditional beliefs and practices. In addition to religious pressure, the Wampanoag people were also subjected to English laws and customs. For example, they were forbidden from hunting on English land, even though they had done so for generations, and they were required to work for the English colonists if they wanted to earn money. This was a sharp departure from the traditional Wampanoag way of life, and it caused a great deal of resentment. The Wampanoag people were also under pressure from within their own society. Many of the younger Wampanoag men had been to Europe, and they had seen the power that the English had there. They knew that the English were a threat, and they wanted to find a way to fight back. At the same time, the English colonists were also feeling the pressure. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, which had been founded in 1630, was growing rapidly. By 1640, there were over 20,000 English settlers in the colony, and they were in desperate need of more land. The only way to do that was to take it from the Wampanoag people. So now we have stage set for an inevitable conflict. On one side are the Wampanoag people, a proud and resilient nation with a deep connection to the land they have inhabited for generations. On the other side are the English colonists, a group of religious zealots who believe they have a divine right to convert the Wampanoag to Christianity and take their land. What'll happen when these two cultures collide? Find out next time on This House. If you love this series, check out the companion podcast, This House in History. Each week, I bring you new stories about amazing places from across the United States and beyond. You can listen to an episode every week on Wednesdays and get early access by becoming a member at our website. Thanks so much for watching. This house is brought to you by a team of historians, and I'm the host. Please make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. You can also check out more of our work on our website or by following us on social media. Until next time, remember, the past is never dead. It's all around us. The year is 1669, and you are watching this channel. Today's episode is titled Metacom's Burden. Alright, let's talk about King Philip today. Let's talk about Metacom. He was the son of Massasoit, and he was born in the year 1638, or 1639. So, he would have been around 29 years old in the year 1668. In fact, when he died, he was only around 32 years old, and Metacom is an important figure because he was the last official ally of the English that fought against them. Okay, so that's kind of a cool thing. Now if you look at him in 1668, 1669, when he was going to war, he was not really the chief. His father, Massasoit, was still the chief. But he was becoming more and more influential, and in some sources, he is called the chief, but he really wasn't. His father was still alive, and I think they may have been confusing him for Metacomet's son, who was called Pomamroot. And later on, when Metacomet was dead, Pomamroot did become the chief. Okay, now Metacomet had spent many years, probably as a young man, trading with the English, and he liked the English ways. He adopted a lot of their ways. He used firearms, he wore European clothing, he apparently was a Christian. I can't find any source that says that he was definitely a Christian, but he had been baptized as a young man, and there is evidence that he actually participated in religious services. So maybe he was a Christian, maybe he wasn't. The point is that he liked the English, and he wanted to be their friend. And we know that because in 1654, while his father was ill, he went to Plymouth and met with the governor, John Endicott, and they renewed the alliance between the English and the Wampanoag. It said that they renewed it in the name of God, which implies that Metacom was a Christian. But anyway, that's what happened. He renewed the alliance with the English. Well, over the next few years, the pressure began to build on Metacom. The English continued to come into New England and multiply. They were building more settlements, and every time they built a new settlement, the pressure was put on the Native Americans to move further west. Now, the English didn't always do this on purpose, okay? Sometimes they would just come in and take land for themselves, but then other times, the leaders would call a meeting with the Native American leaders, and they would tell them, hey, we're gonna take this land. And the Native Americans like, okay, sure. and then they would move the Native Americans further west. And the English kept doing this, and the Native Americans kept moving. Well, by the late 1660s, the pressure was really starting to mount. And we have this letter written by John Danforth to John Winthrop. And it says, quote, "The Indians complain much and are very uneasy at the bounds set to them by the commissioners, especially the Quinnipiac at Sachem, whose bounds were so small that if it had been Rotor land, they could not have lived on it." So this guy, this Sachem, this chief, the leader of the Quinnipiac tribe, told John Danforth, "You know, these borders that you've set for us, we can't even live within them. If it was Rhode Island, we could live there." So it's pretty clear that the pressure was mounting. And the reason why the pressure was mounting was because the English colonies were growing. We have estimates that in the year 1669, there were around 6,000 English colonists in New England. That's a lot. That's more than twice as many as there was just 10 years before. And the pressure from the English kept mounting, and Metacom tried to deal with it diplomatically. But he was getting tired of being pushed around. And finally, in 1671, something happened that pushed him over the edge. In June of 1671, John Danforth came back to New England, and he was brought in to help settle another dispute between the English and the Native Americans. And this time the English wanted the Native Americans to move even further west. And Metacom refused. He got angry, and he was tired of it, and he was saying, "Wait a minute, my father made a deal with your people and you're breaking it." And John Danforth essentially told him to pound sand. And when Metacom realized that the English were going to honor the treaties that they made with his people, he decided to go to war. Now, unfortunately for Metacom, the English had already heard rumors that the Native Americans were planning to attack them, and they were ready. And also, they had an advantage in numbers. Now, if you read a lot of history books about King Philip's War, they'll make it sound like the English vastly outnumbered the Native Americans. That's not true. Okay, there were way more Native Americans than there were English, but the English had more guns. Okay, and that's the advantage that they had. And it is important to remember that warfare in New England in 1675 was very different than warfare in other places. It was not like medieval warfare where two armies meet up and fight each other. No, this was frontier warfare. This was like guerrilla-style stuff, right? So they're fighting over here, then they're going over here. So it was a very difficult kind of war to win. And after the war started, the English colonies formed a kind of a league. They all got together and they basically united to fight the Native Americans. And it was terrible. I mean, the Native Americans were no match for them. The English were able to destroy villages and kill hundreds of Native Americans. And that's when Metacom became a refugee. Now, he ran away. He fled to the west, and he stayed with the Nipmuc people for a little while. Then he tried to go to Canada and get the French to help him, but the French refused. And finally, he went to Martha's Vineyard and tried to hide out. Unfortunately, one of his men betrayed him and told the English where he was, and he was killed in battle. His head was cut off, and then they hung it from the gallows tree in Martha's Vineyard. They also cut off his son's head, and they did the same thing with him. They hung his head from the gallows tree in Plymouth. And that was the end of King Philip and his son. But there's a couple things I want to say about Metacom. First of all, I think he's an interesting figure because he was kind of caught between two worlds. On the one hand, he was a Native American, and he loved his Native American heritage. At the same time, he really liked the English way of life. He was a Christian. He wore English clothes. He ate English food. He had an English name, and so he was caught between two worlds, and ultimately his loyalty to the English cost him his life. Now, on the other hand, I think he's an interesting figure, because he was a leader. He led his people as best he could. But remember, this is the 17th century. The odds were stacked against him. I mean, let's face it, when you're dealing with European nations, the odds are always stacked against you. These guys are coming over here with diseases that you've never seen before, and guns and steel and everything else. It was very hard to resist them. And so I admire Metacom because he tried. I mean, he tried to resist. He tried to keep his people free. He tried to keep their land, but the odds were just too great. And I think we need to remember this because often when we look back at history, we look back at it through the lens of modern ideas. We look back at the Native Americans and we think, Man, why didn't they just unite and kick out the English? Well, it's not that easy because remember, the Native Americans weren't a monolith. Okay, there were many tribes. You had the Pequot, the Narragansett, the Wampanoag, the Mohawk, the Iroquois, the Apache, the Navajo, the Sioux. I mean, there were so many different tribes, and they didn't always get along. They fought each other just as much as they fought the English. So uniting all of the Native American tribes together to kick out the English was not an easy task. And although Metacom tried to unite them for a time, it didn't really work. I mean, some of the tribes fought against him. Some of the tribes refused to help him. So it's important to understand that this was a very difficult situation. Now, I would love to hear from you. What do you think? Leave me a comment in the comments section. Also, don't forget to subscribe. Give me a thumbs up. I love you guys. Thanks for watching. One day while walking through the forest, a Wampanoag man saw a deer caught in a trap. As he approached, he heard voices speaking English and hiding behind trees. The man came upon an English fort, its inhabitants, trying to wrangle the trapped animal. He called out to them, but they did not reply. Instead, one of the men raised his musket. Startled, the native man turned and ran. He heard the gunshot and fell to the ground, clutching his side where the bullet grazed him. Bleeding, he stumbled back to his village. This event, like many others, was recorded by a Wampanoag, man named Caleb Cheeseman, for an 1857 book titled The History of the Wampanoag Tribe on Cape Cod and the Islands, collaborating with Englishmen Francis Jota and J.N.S. Owa Ski. The book describes the turbulent history of the Wampanoag people from their perspective. Unfortunately, the manuscript was never finished, and much of it has been lost to history. But this story, which happened in 1639, illustrates well the growing tensions between the Wampanoag and the English colonists. Hello, and welcome to my channel. I'm the host. This is part 4 of our series about the Mayflower and the Pilgrims. While the first Thanksgiving may have been a time of cooperation and sharing between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, that cooperation soon wore off, and the two groups grew increasingly suspicious of each other. In part 1 of this series, we looked at how disease devastated the Wampanoag population, killing possibly half of them. And in part 2, we explored how both sides blamed each other for the epidemic, each convinced that the other was poisoning them. In part 3, we learned about growing distrust over interracial marriages and the introduction of alcohol to Wampanoag society. These issues caused a rift between the two groups, but land disputes caused deep wounds that neither group could ignore. In 1620, when the Mayflower arrived, the area now known as New England was inhabited by several Algonquian-speaking tribes, including the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts. Neither the Mayflower Compact nor the charter granted to the Pilgrims gave them title to any specific lands. Even so, within a year of their arrival, the English had begun to encroach upon Wampanoag territory. In 1621, the English fort at Plymouth had only about 70 colonists. By 1627, that number had grown to 800. The town had expanded beyond what the Wampanoag called Soams, or the 30-mile swamp, into areas such as Neetuk, where the very first Thanksgiving had been held. To make matters worse, English livestock often trampled Wampanoag crops, causing great frustration and economic loss. Although there were instances of cooperation, such as when Massasoit helped the English build a water-powered sawmill in 1636. By this time, the English were becoming more aggressive in their expansion, purchasing or taking Wampanoag lands. Sometimes these purchases were straightforward, such as when William Bradford and other members of the Plymouth colony purchased land from the Wampanoag chief Massasoit for 60 coats, 60 barrels of corn, a grindstone, and a kettle. Other times, however, the agreements were less than clear. In 1623, the English decided to establish a new settlement near the mouth of the Charles River. Though they had no legal claim to the area, they sent an envoy to purchase the land from the local sachem, but because of a miscommunication, or perhaps coercion, he agreed to sell all of New England from the southern border of the Wampanoag territory, all the way to Maine. Although this agreement was later discovered to be a mistake, It went a long way toward justifying English expansion northward. As the colonies grew, the English began to accuse the Wampanoag of stealing livestock, which they believed was being done by Metacom, Massasoit's son. Perhaps as retaliation for the theft, in 1636, the English imposed heavy fines on the Wampanoag, forcing them to pay £20 for every stolen animal. When the Wampanoag could not come up with the money, their homes and belongings were confiscated and sold to cover the debt. Unable to buy back their homes, the Wampanoag were forced to move further west, losing more of their ancestral lands. There are other instances of English settlers assuming that the Wampanoag owned the deer they hunted. You see, the Wampanoag didn't think of themselves as owning the deer, but rather that they had the right to hunt them. There wasn't a concept of private ownership of wild animals in their culture. But when an Englishman killed a deer on Wampanoag hunting grounds, the Wampanoag sometimes demanded payment for the animal. When the Englishman refused, the issue would go to court. And because the English judge and jury were biased, the rulings always favored the English settler. One such case took place in 1643 when two Englishmen were hunting on Wampanoag land. When one of them killed a buck, the other, Thomas Morton, objected because he had meant to kill that deer himself. In response, his companion shot Morton, who then brought the shooter to court. Again, because of English bias, the hunter was acquitted of wrongdoing. These incidents illustrate some of the ways that Wampanoag and English cultures clashed, leading to mistrust and resentment. Accusations of theft weren't the only way that the English attempted to take Wampanoag lands. In 1651, the General Court of Massachusetts passed a law that required anyone living in the colony to attend church services. For Puritans, non-attendance demonstrated a lack of piety and obedience to God. But for the Wampanoag, whose religious practices were drastically different, the law threatened their very survival. When converted Wampanoag men attended church services, they were ridiculed for their speech impediment and inability to read English. Eventually, attendance became mandatory for Wampanoag women and children as well. But when they showed up to services, they were told that they weren't sufficiently dressed and were fined for their clothing. Many Wampanoag resorted to making show of worship by pretending to pray while hiding in the woods. Not surprisingly, they were also fined for this form of non-compliance. Soon, many of their homes and possessions were taken because they couldn't afford to pay their fines. Although the English tried to eradicate native religions, the Wampanoag never stopped practicing their beliefs, even after generations of persecution. Today, the Wampanoag continue to hold ceremonies on Cape Cod and the islands and keep their traditions alive. But as the years passed, the cracks in the covenant between the Wampanoag and the English grew wider, filled with suspicion, resentment, and pain. At the start of our series, we looked at a letter written by Edward Winslow in which he described the Wampanoag as naked savages. But the English weren't exactly paragons of virtue themselves. It is important to remember that the Wampanoag were the only ones who wrote about their experiences during this time. The Wampanoag account of the events of 1620 differ from the English versions. For instance, the English claimed that the Wampanoag welcomed them and helped them survive. But according to the Wampanoag, the natives weren't too happy about the English presence, seeing them as outsiders. The Wampanoag had lived in New England for thousands of years and were perfectly adapted to the environment. They had thriving communities that were self-sufficient and sustained by the land. When the English arrived, they brought diseases that devastated the natives, as well as attitudes and beliefs that they tried to impose on others. When the English arrived in 1620, the Wampanoag thought they were foreigners. They had no idea that the newcomers would eventually try to take their lands and destroy their way of life. Unfortunately, the story of the first Thanksgiving overshadows the difficult history that followed, and although it's important to understand the contributions of those early European settlers, it is equally vital to listen to the stories of the indigenous people who were here first, and how they fought to preserve their culture and way of life. And I want to thank our supporters for making it possible for us to share these stories. And if you would like to help us bring these historical tales to a broader audience, please consider supporting us. Thank you for watching. Last time we talked about Metacom's diplomatic mission to Albany in the spring of 1675. That was episode 3, A Mission to Albany. If you haven't seen it yet, go check it out. After that meeting with the English, Metacom returned to his headquarters near Mount Hope with no treaty, but instead an ultimatum. Now he had until June 1st to deliver the goods, or the English would consider him an enemy. When they didn't hear back from him by June, the colonial militia in Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Plymouth began to mobilize. Even before that, though, fighting broke out between the colonists and Native Americans in western Massachusetts in what is now called the First Indian War, King Philip's War. In this video, we're going to see how fear and anger spiral out of control and cause both sides to push for war. Let's get to it. So in our last video, we saw that after receiving the ultimatum from the English, Metacom needed to decide whether or not he wanted to fight a war against them. In his position, it was a tough choice. On one hand, he wanted to stop the colonists from encroaching on Native American lands. On the other hand, he knew that open warfare with the colonies would be brutal and costly for his people. But while he deliberated over the best course of action, things were happening in western Massachusetts that would force his decision. On May 24th, 1675, a group of 18 English men led by John, a converted Native American, left their settlement at Deerfield and headed into the wilderness to look for some wild game. Their wives and children had been complaining that there wasn't enough meat in the stores. Unfortunately, though, the forest held no bounty that day, because a band of about 500 Native Americans ambushed and massacred them all. Only one man survived the attack, and he escaped by playing dead. This event became known as the Bloody Massacre at Deerfield. Now, we don't know who planned the attack, but soon the blame fell on Metacom. Why? After the massacre, the militia in the Massachusetts Bay Colony called upon their old ally, Captain John Church, to lead a punitive expedition into Native American territory. He took the sole survivor of the massacre and used him as a guide. They found the village where the attackers had stayed the night before and burned it to the ground. They also found a Narragansett Indian named Cannon, who was a prisoner there. And when they questioned him about the attack, he pointed the finger at Metacom. So the English concluded that it was him. Now, if you've been watching this series since the beginning, then you know that this story isn't quite so simple. See, we met Metacom in episode 2. We know that he was the Sagamore of the Wampanoag tribe in southeastern Massachusetts, but during the French and Indian War, he lived among the Narragansetts in Rhode Island, which is where Cannon was from. It's also true that he visited Albany that spring, and that put him far away from Deerfield, Massachusetts. But here's the thing. Before he went to Albany, he wrote a letter to the colonial governor in Boston, telling him that the settlers in western Massachusetts were encroaching on Native American land, and that he was concerned it might lead to violence. When the governor didn't reply, Metacom did something unprecedented. He sent his brother to Boston to demand that the government protect Native Americans from the encroachment, and then he set out west to stop the violence himself. When he heard about the massacre at Deerfield, he was already on the move. He rushed back east and spent a week trying to get through to the English. Finally, he reached out to an old friend, Job Hopkinson, who served as an interpreter in much of his dealings with the English, and told him about the attack. And he warned him that his warriors were ready to fight. Then he disappeared into the forest, and the English never heard from him again. But in the eyes of the colonists, Metacom was responsible for the massacre, and in response to the attack, they seized his 2 sons, Wamsutta and Wheat, along with several other Native Americans from the area, and charged them with conspiracy to murder. The problem for the colonists was that they couldn't prove anything. The only evidence they had were the words of a captive Native American, and that was hearsay at best. Besides, they knew that Metacom was innocent. He had made too many efforts for peace. He even offered to turn over any of the attackers to the English in exchange for his own freedom and the freedom of his kin. But the colonists refused. They saw the prisoners as bargaining chips in an upcoming war, and they marched them all the way to Boston to make sure that they couldn't escape. When Metacom's people heard that his sons were captured, they wanted to fight back. His brother, Alexander, known as Tangier, among the English, demanded that he led the tribes in war against the colonists. But Metacom refused. He had hoped to avoid bloodshed, and he wasn't willing to start a war just yet. The problem was that there was little he could do to stop those who wanted revenge. When Metacom went to Albany that spring, he brought 2 men with him, John Seaman and a young warrior named Sim. Both of them had been in the French and Indian War and hated the colonists with every fiber of their being. While Metacom was gone, Sasuman and Simpatico stoked the fires of war among the Native Americans in western Massachusetts. They argued that the only way to protect their lands was to join forces and drive the English back to the sea. And the more they talked, the more the idea of war seemed like a good one. And then came the bloody massacre at Deerfield, and it pushed everyone over the edge. Sasuman and Simpatico called for a grand council of all the tribes to meet at the end of May in what is now western Massachusetts. There, leaders from dozens of tribes met and agreed to fight a war against the colonists. The timing was perfect. All the while, the colony of Massachusetts Bay was preparing for war. In April, the General Court appointed a committee to oversee the defense of the colony. They created local committees in each town to elect militia officers and register able-bodied men. By the end of the month, they had 23 companies of foot soldiers ready to fight. And then news arrived from Connecticut that the Mohegans were arming for war. On May 10th, the Massachusetts governor declared that the colony was in a state of war. Meanwhile, Rhode Island was preparing for conflict, too. When they heard that Metacom's sons were imprisoned in Boston, they mobilized their militia and sent Major Benedict Arnold to seize Fort Massachusetts at the mouth of Narragansett Bay. But when he got there, he found that the fort was empty. The previous commander had moved his entire garrison to Boston for fear of attack, so Arnold took possession of the fort and garrisoned it with 50 men. Then, a few days later, on May 29th, 1675, armed Mohegan and Nipmuc men attacked it. After a long battle, they chased the English soldiers off the island and seized Fort Massachusetts. The war had begun. For Metacom, the war that he feared most had finally broken out. Just months ago, he tried everything he could to prevent this moment, but now he was branded a murderer by the English and labeled a traitor by the Iroquois. To survive, he had to choose a side and pick up a weapon. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember to leave your comments below. Thanks to my supporters for helping me tell these stories. If you would like to support the channel, please subscribe. Until next time, remember, history doesn't always happen on the battlefield. When the fighting finally came to the Connecticut River Valley, it did not come in the form that the colonists had expected. They had talked about attacks from Canada, perhaps even from the north, through New York. No one was prepared for what actually happened. In the summer of 1775, British naval forces based out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, began to move westward with the aim of capturing strategic locations along the Connecticut River. On August 9th, 1775, a fleet of 3 ships and 5 landing boats carrying 200 British soldiers arrived off the coast of Rehoboth. The troops landed near the village and marched on it, catching the town by surprise. The villagers had no weapons and no time to prepare for defense. Many were killed or taken captive. While others fled into the woods, the soldiers looted the town, burned 12 buildings, and destroyed 3 mills before re-embarking and moving on to their next target. A few days later, on August 14th, 1775, British naval forces arrived off the coast of Taunton, Massachusetts, just as they had at Rehoboth. This time, however, there was a much larger force with more than 800 British soldiers landing near the town. Once again, the soldiers marched on the village, driving the inhabitants into the nearby woods where they hid among the trees and watched their homes burn. Only 3 buildings were spared by the British, who seized several prisoners before departing. The following day, August 15th, 1775, the British reached the settlement of Brookfield. Here, they met armed resistance for the first time. A group of 40-minute men fired on the troops from behind trees and stone walls, forcing them to retreat back to their boats. But the respite was short-lived. More British troops arrived that night and pushed the minute men back. Then they did exactly what they had done at Rehoboth and Taunton, burning all the buildings except 3 and taking several prisoners. The British then set sail down the Connecticut River, destroying plantations and farms along the way. One eyewitness wrote, "We could not but wonder at the sudden flames which appeared at intervals along the riverside. In a word, all before us was one continued scene of fire. As the British ships sailed past settlements, their boats would go ashore and seize any able-bodied men they could find, hauling them aboard and forcing them to work as rowers, often under threat of being thrown overboard without a moment's notice." News of these devastating raids spread like wildfire throughout the countryside, shocking the colonists, who believed they had nothing to fear from an attack in the region. The eastern towns had heard tales of the destruction wrought by British forces in places like Concord and Lexington, and they knew that the countryside west of the river had been suffering greatly since the beginning of the war. But they had assumed that because they were so far from the fighting, their lives would be unaffected. After all, how could anyone get to Connecticut from New York without passing through Springfield? And how could the British possibly mount an attack from Canada without conquering all of New England first? The Swift's native raids proved that the region was indeed vulnerable, and this realization compelled them to take action. Throughout the summer of 1775, militia companies had formed in many of the Connecticut River Valley towns, training in the art of war and watching the conflict rage to the east. Now they were being called upon to defend their own communities. From Deerfield, William Shepherd wrote to his cousin in Stockbridge, "Our town is now full of arms, and we have a company of militia formed here. You must excuse me if my letter is short, for we are expecting every moment to be ordered to arms, as the enemy are just over the river." But the militia was not the only force being mobilized in the valley. Loyalists were also banding together in defense of the crown. Even though most of the region was strongly opposed to British rule, there was a sizable minority of Tories scattered throughout the Connecticut River Valley. In fact, Toryism ran strongest here, bolstered by the region's relative prosperity and its close economic ties to Britain. And when news of Swift's natives' attack reached them, they jumped at the opportunity to join the fight and repel the invaders. Near the end of August, one such group of loyalists gathered at the home of Captain John Chester in Coventry, Connecticut. There they signed the covenant of the Society of the Sons of Liberty and of the King's Friends. It was agreed by all of us that we will stand by each other in defense of His Majesty King George II in the utmost of our power against rebels, traitors, and rebel traitors and seditionists, and all those who do or shall oppose His said Majesty's authority, government, and dominion. We also entered into an agreement to raise a company of expert riflemen and minutemen, well armed and accounted, to be ready at a minute's warning to march against rebels and traitors. Not long after, they raised a flag for their new regiment, a red field with a white cross bearing the motto Liberty and Union. But the society never saw active combat because on September 5th, 1775, American forces captured and imprisoned many of its members. While the situation in the Connecticut River Valley was certainly dire, it wasn't hopeless. Despite the damage they had done, Swift's natives' raids were too far inland for the Royal Navy to support. Their ships could not travel upstream during the winter months, which meant that the river froze over and the British could not resupply the troops on shore. So Swift native left the valley in early September, returning to Rhode Island and abandoning their plan to capture the Connecticut River. The colonists were left to survey the damage. Homes and businesses were burned to the ground. Crops were destroyed. Livestock was stolen and people were missing. The feeling of security that had sustained them throughout the early years of the war was gone. They realized that at any moment, their lives could change in an instant. In fact, that's exactly what happened for many of them just 2 weeks later, when on September 28, 1775, another group of British soldiers descended upon the Connecticut River town of Deerfield. You can hear about their harrowing escape in the next episode of our series, Escape from Deerfield. In addition to planning and executing daring raids, Swift native was also skilled at propaganda. He understood the value of controlling the narrative, and he used every opportunity to paint himself as a liberator. For example, after burning the town of Taunton, he wrote to the Select Committee of Safety, denouncing slavery and calling for the emancipation of Africans in Mass. Of course, he didn't actually care about ending slavery. He simply thought it would win him some support among the patriots. Despite his efforts, however, the vast majority of the colonists remained steadfastly opposed to British rule. In fact, some of them went even further than that. They wanted revenge. Groups of men began forming with the goal of invading Canada. Although most of these expeditions were doomed to fail due to a lack of resources, planning, or both, they nevertheless represented a growing sentiment among the colonists, the desire to drive the British out of North America once and for all. One such group set out from the Connecticut River Valley in November 1775, led by Captain Samuel Brewer. This band of 18 men made it all the way to Quebec. Before turning back, while they did not succeed in their mission, they did capture the imagination of the colonists. Stories of their bravery spread throughout the region and inspired others to try their hand at invading Canada. As the war dragged on and the colonists suffered more and more defeats at the hands of the British, the desire to strike back at the heart of the empire only grew stronger. It wasn't long before someone came along who was willing to lead them there. If you want to learn more about the invasion of Canada, check out our companion series, The Invasion of Canada, available exclusively on a streaming platform. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you'll consider subscribing so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. And if you'd like to support us even further and get some cool perks in return, consider becoming a patron. The link is in the description. Thanks again for watching. See you next time. Friends and foes can be hard to keep track of sometimes. For Native Americans in New England, keeping track of friends and foes was more than sometimes. It was critical to their survival. Hi everyone. Welcome to this house. Today we're going to look at some Native American tribes in New England who found themselves in a world where their very survival depended upon whom they could call friend and whom they could call foe. As we continue our series about the Native Americans in New England, we're going to take a look at the Narragansett and the Nipmuc people. Both were Native American tribes that had been living in southern New England for thousands of years when European colonizers arrived. But when the Europeans began encroaching further and further into the tribal lands, the Narragansett and the Neponset found themselves having to make some very difficult choices about who to align themselves with. The choices they made would have far-reaching consequences, shaping not only their own fates, but also the course of history itself. The Narragansett people lived along the coast of what is now Rhode Island and southern Massachusetts. They were known for their maritime skills and their ability to navigate the waters of Narragansett Bay. Their villages were often situated near the coast, and their diet consisted of a variety of seafood, including fish, shellfish, and fowl. In addition to fishing, the Narragansett also engaged in agriculture, growing crops such as corn, squash, and beans. They also hunted game such as deer and wild turkeys. Despite their relatively comfortable lifestyle, however, the Narragansett would soon find themselves caught in the crossfire of a conflict between two powerful European colonial rivals, the English and the Dutch. In the early 1600s, the Dutch West India Company began exploring and trading in the region, and by the 1620s, they had established a settlement in present-day Albany. New York, as the Dutch presence grew, so did the threat they posed to the Narragansett people. The Dutch were encroaching on Narragansett land, and their growing population meant that the Narragansett would soon be in greater competition for resources. As the pressure mounted, the Narragansett leaders began to seek out allies among the other native peoples of the region. One such ally was the Mohegan tribe, who lived further north in present-day Connecticut. The Mohegan were a powerful and warlike people, and their alliance with the Narragansett gave them a significant advantage over the Dutch. Together, they were able to resist the Dutch encroachment and maintain their control over their lands. However, the situation would soon change dramatically with the arrival of the English. In 1636, the English colony of Massachusetts Bay was founded, and with it came a new set of challenges and opportunities for the Narragansett. The English were different from the Dutch in many ways. They were more interested in settling the land rather than simply trading on it, and they were also more aggressive in their dealings with the native peoples. As the English colony grew, the Narragansett found themselves under increasing pressure to sell their land, despite the fact that the Narragansett had resisted the Dutch and had even fought alongside the Mohegan against them. They were now facing a new and more formidable enemy. The English were determined to expand their territory, and they were willing to use force to do so. The Narragansett, on the other hand, were relatively peaceful people who had never before had to defend themselves against such a powerful and determined foe. In the face of this new challenge, the Narragansett leaders made a fateful decision to side with the English against the Dutch. This decision was not made lightly. The Narragansett had a long history of trade and diplomacy with the Dutch, and they had even fought alongside the Mohegan against them. But the English were a growing power in the region, and the Narragansett felt that they had no choice but to align themselves with them in order to survive. This decision would have far-reaching consequences for the Narragansett people, as well as for the course of history itself. By siding with the English, the Narragansett became embroiled in a conflict that would ultimately result in the destruction of their way of life. Quote, War of 1636 to 1638 was a conflict between the English colonists in New England and the Pequot tribe. The war was fought over land rights and control of the fur trade in southern New England. The Pequot were a powerful tribe with a strong military force, but they were eventually defeated by the English and their Native American allies. The war resulted in the deaths of hundreds of Pequot men, women and children, and the tribe's removal from their ancestral lands. The Mohegan and the Narragansett had been allies of the Pequot, but when the fighting began, they quickly switched sides and sided with the English. The Mohegan in particular played a significant role in the war, providing valuable military and intelligence assistance to the English. The reasons for their switch are complex and varied. Some historians suggest that the Mohegans saw an opportunity to advance their own interests by allying themselves with the English, while others argue that they were motivated by fear and self-preservation. Whatever the true motivations may have been, the Mohegans' decision to side with the English proved to be a pivotal moment in the conflict and had lasting consequences for the Native Americans in New England. One of the most important aspects of the Mohegans' involvement in the Pequot War was their provision of intelligence to the English. The Mohegans were familiar with the land and the terrain of southern New England, and they used this knowledge to help the English track and ambush the Pequot. The Mohegans also provided the English with valuable information about Pequot military strength and strategy, which allowed the English to anticipate and counter Pequot attacks. This intelligence gathering and sharing played a key role in the eventual defeat of the Pequot. Another important contribution that the Mohegan made to the war effort was their military support. The Mohegan were skilled fighters, and their participation in the war gave the English a significant advantage over the Pequot. While the exact numbers of Mohegan warriors who fought alongside the English are unknown, it is clear that they played a significant role in the conflict. The Mohegan-esque military prowess and their knowledge of warfare tactics were invaluable to the English and helped to ensure their ultimate victory. But the Mohegans' involvement in the Pequot War was not without its costs. As the war dragged on and the Pequot became more desperate, they began to target Mohegan villages and settlements. The Mohegan suffered significant losses of life and property as a result of these attacks. Additionally, the Mohegan were caught in the middle of a conflict between two powerful forces and had to carefully navigate the shifting alliances and loyalties of the various Native American tribes involved in the war. Despite these challenges, however, the Mohegan remained steadfast in their commitment to the English cause and played a crucial role in the defeat of the Pequot. While the Mohegan sided with the English during the Pequot War, the Narragansett remained officially neutral. However, their neutrality was often challenged, and they were drawn into the conflict on several occasions. For example, in 1637, the English and their Native American allies launched a surprise attack on the Pequot fort at Mystic. The Narragansett had maintained good relations with the Pequot and were caught off guard by the attack. Nevertheless, they were forced to choose a side, and many Narragansett warriors joined the fight against their former allies, despite their efforts. However, the Narragansett were unable to prevent the destruction of the Pequot, and the war would ultimately have devastating consequences for them as well. In the aftermath of the Pequot War, the Narragansett and Mohegan found themselves in a precarious position. The English had emerged victorious from the conflict and were eager to expand their territory. The Narragansett, despite their efforts to remain neutral, had been drawn into the fighting and had suffered significant losses. As the English began to assert their dominance over southern New England, the Narragansett and Mohegan had to navigate the shifting alliances and loyalties of the various colonial powers in order to protect their interests. Despite their best efforts, however, the Narragansett and Mohegan would soon find themselves at odds with the English and would be forced to fight to defend their land and their way of life. In the end, the Pequot War would have a devastating impact on the Native Americans in New England. The Pequot were nearly wiped out, and the Narragansett and Mohegan would suffer significant losses as well. The war would also mark a turning point in the relationship between the Native Americans and the English colonists, setting the stage for further conflicts and the eventual displacement of the Native Americans from their ancestral lands. Friendships and rivalries can be a complex thing. Sometimes it can feel like you coup and keep up with who is your friend and who is your foe. And if you're a Native American in New England in the early 1600s, it must have felt like an earthquake was shaking the very foundations of your world. The alliances that had once seemed solid were crumbling, and new ones were being forged in the fires of adversity. The Pequot War was a tragic chapter in history, but it also offers us a glimpse into the lives of the Native Americans who lived in New England. We see their strength, their resilience, and their capacity for both great kindness and great cruelty. As we look back on this tumultuous period, let us remember the lessons of the past and strive to create a better future for all. And thank you for watching. Please subscribe and come back soon for more stories about this time and place. See you next time. Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Today we are going to remember December 1675. And on this day, ate into the swamps, the Great Swamp Fight, one of the most brutal battles of King Philip's War. This will be the longest battle of the entire war, lasting for over 2 hours, and it will result in the deaths of over 100 Native Americans and 20 colonists. The previous day, Major Benjamin Church and his company of 80 colonial soldiers had been following a large group of Native Americans near the Saconet River in Rhode Island. The Native Americans had fled from an attack by another company of colonial soldiers under Captain John Clark at the Bloody Angle earlier that week, and now they were trying to regroup at their fort in the middle of the swamplands of the Saconet. But when Church arrived, he found that the Native Americans had already fortified the place with several blockhouses built out of thick logs and connected together by a palisade. So Church spent the night watching the Native Americans inside and preparing to attack. He stationed his men along the bank of the river, set up artillery pieces, and waited for dawn. December arrived cold and frosty. The sun rose over the ice-jammed river, illuminating the frost-covered grasses and trees of the New England winter. But this would be no day for pretty pictures, because when the sun reached its zenith and the frost had thawed somewhat, Church was going to assault the fortress. He ordered 3 of his men to paddle across the river to get close to the fortress. They were to light their fuses, paddle back across the river, then run as fast as they could toward the west. Church hoped that the diversion would cause the Native Americans inside the fortress to rush to the riverbank to defend themselves, and if all went according to plan, then his men would have an easier time taking the fortress. The 3 men paddled out into the river and toward the shore opposite the fort. A few of the Native Americans noticed them and started firing at the men, but they kept paddling. One of the men would later claim that he had to paddle hard not to hit the floating chunks of ice, which the current was pushing out from the riverbank. When they reached the shoreline, the men quickly waded ashore and ran to hide behind some trees. They pulled out red-hot musket balls wrapped in cloth and dropped them through the cracks in the fort's palisade. Then they ran for cover as musket fire exploded from the fort. Church watched as the Native Americans rushed to the riverbank to stop the fiery projectiles. And when the defenders were distracted, his men charged across the river, firing their muskets as they ran. Soon, hand-to-hand fighting was underway. The colonists had brought long pikes to the fight, which proved very useful against the Native American defenders armed with tomahawks and guns. The pikes would have been excellent weapons in the open field, but would prove nearly useless in the thick underbrush and dark confines of the fort. This resulted in many of the colonists having to rely on their hunting knives and their fists to finish off their opponents. It must have been a terrifying sight for any Native American who came upon a party of frenzied Englishmen wielding pikes, screaming and fighting in the dark. And yet somehow the Native Americans managed to hold out for quite some time. Unfortunately for them, though they were greatly outnumbered, whenever a defender fell, 2 or more colonists would jump in to make sure that he did not get back up. And although the fighting was fierce, the colonists gradually pushed the Native Americans back. A thick fog rolled in, adding to the eerie atmosphere of the battle, and when the mist combined with the smoke from the countless firearms, it made seeing nearly impossible. The colonists took advantage of this to sneak around the fortress, firing at any Native Americans they could see and stabbing anyone who got too close. Many of the Native Americans fell victim to friendly fire. As the defenders struggled to see through the smoke and fog, it is said that one of the leaders of the Native Americans fought until he was wounded 4 times. His name was Colonial, and he was the son of the great Sachem, or chief, of the tribe Metacom. Known by the colonists as King Philip, after being wounded 4 times, he fled to a nearby swamp with a small group of survivors. When the fog cleared, the colonists found the fort abandoned. They searched the area for the Native Americans, but only found a few dead bodies. They dragged Colonial's body back to the riverbank and left it there, along with the other dead Native Americans. Then they prepared to leave. As darkness fell once again, the colonists heard a noise in the forest and assumed that it was the Native Americans returning to retake their fort. They set up camp for the night and prepared to defend themselves. But the next morning, when the sun rose, they found that they had been attacked in the night. A small group of Native Americans had snuck in and built a fire near their camp. When the colonists had approached the fort the previous day, they had unknowingly trampled on a large beehive. The bees had become enraged and followed the men to their campsite. During the night, the angry insects had attacked the sleeping colonists, driving them away from their camp and forcing them to flee into the forest. It was clear that the great swamp fight had ended in a victory for the colonists. The fort was destroyed, and there was no sign of the Native Americans. But this victory came at a price. Of the 80 soldiers who had assaulted the fortress, 23 were dead and 46 wounded. The casualties for the Native Americans would likely have been much higher, except that they were able to escape into the swamplands. There was one problem, though. Major Church had lost his commission papers during the battle, and without them, he was afraid that he would lose his commission. He decided to do something crazy to try and recover the documents. He returned to the fort site and walked through the wreckage until he found his lost papers. This proved to be a huge mistake, because a group of about 200 Native Americans had returned to the fort while he was there. They were led by a man named Odimo, who had escaped the battle and had taken his revenge on the bee-attacked colonists by burning their camp. Now, when Odimo and his warriors arrived at the riverbank, they saw a lone Englishman wandering around the ruins of their fort. Odimo wanted to capture Church alive, so that he could ransom him to the English. So he called out to Church and asked him to surrender. Chud replied that he would not surrender unless they gave him back his commission papers. The Native Americans threw the papers back to him and Church put them in his pocket. As he turned to leave, Odimo shouted at him to wait. He told Church that he had a present for him. Then he signaled to his warriors, who started shooting at Church. He quickly ran for cover, drawing his sword as he ran. He dodged behind a log just in time as a ball whistled past his head and buried itself in the ground beside him. Odimo and his warriors kept firing at him, but Church was safe behind his log, and since he had no way of defending himself, he started yelling at the Native Americans. He called them cowards and told them how brave he was, how he had defeated them at their fort, and how he was the terror of New England. All the while, he kept peeking around his log to make sure they did not charge him. After a while, Odawa and his men grew tired of shooting at the log, and Odawa decided to approach it and try to cut Church's head off with his tomahawk. Church knew what was coming, and he started yelling louder than ever. Odawa got within 10 feet of the log before he saw Church pop up, holding his sword and growling like a wild animal. Odawa screamed and turned to run. Church jumped over the log and ran after him, slashing at the Native American with his sword. Odawa was fast and managed to escape Church's blade, but the chase was short-lived. Church caught up with him near the riverbank and cut him down. The Native American fell to his knees and begged for mercy. But Church was in no mood for prisoners. He hacked Odawa's head off and stuck it on a pole. Then he returned to the riverbank to find his men. Church and his men stayed in the area for a few days, searching for Native Americans and burying the dead. On December, they found King Philip's son, Canon Shea, and killed him. They also killed any Native Americans they came across, but they never found Odimu's body. Some historians believe that he escaped to Canada, while others say that the Native Americans buried him in the swamplands. Whatever happened to him, his escape would allow him to live for another year, and it would be another year before the English would finally kill King Philip and end the war. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Be sure to follow us if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Winter is coming. The cold wind blows through the barren trees and across the frozen lake. Smoke drifts from the few homes that are still standing in the village. And what is this stench? Is that the smell of death? We hear the cry of a lonely wolf, and now we see him. He's gaunt, his ribs showing through his matted fur. The settlers called him Wolf, and there's something haunting about his eyes. And here comes one of the most terrifying things imaginable. That is not the Grim Reaper, it's Mary. She seems so frail, she could blow away in the wind like a dried leaf. But what makes her so scary is her white face paint and the tomahawk she's holding. Now she begins to dance. Not a joyful dance, but a frightening one. She stamps her feet on the frozen ground and sometimes raises her arms like wings. This is a war dance. Deep in the forest, a young Iroquois man watches them. His name is Anantio. He's only 17 years old, but already a great warrior. Or he will be when the time is right. Meanwhile, he lives with his family in a longhouse near the lake. They have food stored for the winter, but soon it'll run out. When spring comes and the snows melt, the people can hunt and fish again. But until then, they need to ration their food carefully. Ananthio goes out into the forest to hunt, but there is nothing to catch. There are no deer or rabbits. All the animals have moved south for the winter, except for the wolves, but they are too skinny to eat. So Ananthio returns home without any food. When he tells the tribe's chief, his father, that he was unsuccessful, the chief frowns. There isn't enough food for everyone, but if he could just get some meat for the women and children, that would be ideal. There is an abundant supply of fish in the lake, but to catch them, he needs his nets. And the nets were lost when the fort burned his village last summer. It's true that the Iroquois lived by the lake, fished its waters, and hunted the animals that came to eat its fish. But the fort and the fields where the colonists grew corn are located on the other side of the lake. To reach the fort, one has to walk along the shore because there are no roads. The Iroquois never built roads. Each village was self-sufficient and had everything it needed, so they didn't need to travel much. And besides, all the villages were close together. You could walk from one to the next in a day. However, the colonists settled far away from each other and were always moving further west, so they needed roads. The first thing they did was build Fort Hunter. In the early days, the fort was a safe haven for the colonists. It was made of thick logs, had high walls, and a deep ditch. The Iroquois couldn't attack it. Inside the fort, the colonists could work in peace to build new homes and clear the fields. They planted wheat, barley, corn, and vegetables. They also built more permanent houses instead of the tents they had brought with them. Some even started small businesses. Among them was John Reed. He ran a tavern. No doubt there were many evenings filled with singing and dancing there. After all, the colonists were pioneers who dreamed of freedom and a better life. In addition to men, women and children lived in the fort, along with dogs and livestock. It was like a real city. But it wasn't only the Iroquois who lived on the shores of the lake. One day, two Huron warriors paddled their canoe onto the shore. They were members of a tribe that lived between the Iroquois and the colonists. The Hurons were allied with the French and were fierce enemies of the Iroquois. The Huron warriors wanted to buy some corn from the colonists. At first, the plan worked. The Iroquois were afraid to go outside the fort, so the colonists had no competitors in trade with the Iroquois. But eventually, the fort became overcrowded. There were too many people inside the stockade. It was hard to find food and the people were getting sick, so the governor decided to let some families move out. As soon as they got their own farm, they had to build new homes. But who would protect them from the Iroquois? That's why the governor organized patrols to keep watch on the borders. Meanwhile, word reached the Iroquois that the colonists had food. In the spring, raids began, but the Iroquois couldn't do much damage. After all, the fort was protected, but then a terrible disease struck the colonists. It's unknown whether it was smallpox, plague, or cholera. No one knows how the disease got to the fort, but people started dying, and then something horrible happened. The dead started being buried inside the fort, but there wasn't enough land to bury everyone. Then they started digging a big pit outside the fort. Everyone was scared to go near it, but one evening, a colonist went over to the pit and stole a corpse. The next morning, the people found that corpse hanging from the top of the fort wall. It was Ananthio. He took revenge for his brother who died of starvation and was buried in that pit. After that, the raids became bolder. The Iroquois attacked the colonists' farms and killed their cattle. The colonists suffered heavy losses and decided to abandon their settlements. They didn't destroy anything on purpose, but entire villages burned down. Crops, homes, and barns were lost to the flames. The attackers were fast and disappeared into the forest before the defenders could mount any resistance. Only one building was left standing. Its roof collapsed as recently as 1983. And archaeologists were able to confirm that it belonged to a tannery. They found tools of the colonists' trade and household items in the ruins. Among the colonists who fled were the Reed family. They pulled down their house so the Iroquois wouldn't use it for shelter. Their barn burned down, but they managed to save some food supplies. The Reed family stayed at Fort Hunter for a while, but when they saw that the Iroquois were no longer attacking, they set off to the north. They walked along the lake shore, and when they saw the village they once lived in, they felt horrified. Nothing remained of it but ashes. They continued their journey until they found another survivor camp. There they met Mary. She was different from the other colonists. Her face was painted red, and she wore a leather dress. Mary was part Native American and part French. She was considered a traitor by the colonists and the Iroquois, but she knew the forest well and could survive in it. She led the Reed family to a secret cache of food. It was probably left by the French. Later, the Reeds joined a group of about 40 survivors and headed to the nearest fort. During the trek, Martha's son fell ill and died. The next morning, his body was gone. A pack of wolves had dragged him away. The survivors kept walking until they saw a column of smoke rising above the trees. When they got closer, they realized that it was the smoke of a campfire. But there was no village nearby. Suddenly, Ananthio appeared from behind a tree. He raised his hand in greeting. When the leader of the group asked him how he could help them, Ananthio replied, "I am your greatest enemy. Your people have killed my brothers." The leader drew his gun, but Ananthio disappeared into the woods before the first shot was fired. And what happened next? What happened to the colonists? Did they ever realize that not all Iroquois warriors were like Ananthio? In 1680, the Iroquois and the Huron allied themselves with the French and defeated the colonists in a battle near the same lake. After the war, the Iroquois seized a lot of land. The colony, which was once larger than France itself, became so small that it was practically invisible on the maps of North America. For the Iroquois, the war with the colonists was a victory, but it cost them dearly. Tens of thousands perished from disease and hunger, and when the victorious warriors returned to their villages, they found them deserted. The war had been going on for so long that the villagers had left and gone to live with other tribes. When the Iroquois finally won the war and chased the colonists into the sea, they had to start over and rebuild their villages. They never forgot the lessons of that war. From then on, whenever the Iroquois saw a white cloud in the sky, they thought it was a ship sailing over from England. Winter is coming. Soon the snow will cover the land, and the Iroquois will have to huddle around their fires to wait out the cold. But they will not be alone. With them will be Mary, the woman in the white war bonnet. She may be frail and bony, but she's strong and smart. She'll take care of the children, and perhaps she'll teach them how to fight, too. From February through April of 1676, a series of brutal Native American raids would devastate the towns of Lancaster, Medfield, and the Plymouth colony. More than 200 colonists would be killed and entire towns would be destroyed. As you'll see, this was a pivotal moment in the Anglo-Native conflict in New England. So stay tuned to find out more about King Philip's War in the next episode. Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. It's me. Today we're going to discuss one of the most traumatic episodes in early colonial history, the raids of early 1676, otherwise known as 10 Flames, across New England. Now before we get into it, let me just say that we have made every effort to pronounce all of the native names correctly and to acknowledge the people who helped us with that. So in May of 1675, war had broken out between the English colonists and the Native Americans in southern New England. The conflict would become known as King Philip's War, named for the great Sachem Metacom, also known as King Philip of the Wampanoag Nation. For more information on the causes of the war, be sure to check out our episode on Metacom's Confederacy. The first major engagement of the war occurred at Bloody Brook in August, and after that battle, things quieted down until late January of 1676. During that time, the colonial leaders reorganized their forces. They created a council of war composed of representatives from each colony, formed a central government under the presidency of Captain General Thomas Stanton, and they began building fortifications around towns and along major roads. They also conducted recruitment drives to raise troops. And what did the Native Americans do during this time? Well, that's a great question, and the answer is that we don't really know. You see, the historical record is almost completely silent on the activities of the Native Americans during this time period. We know that the Confederated tribes were regrouping and planning because that's what all military forces do. But we have very little information on their plans or their preparations. This is a huge gap in our knowledge, and it is a good example of why it is important to examine primary sources from multiple perspectives. Since so many of the written accounts of this war are from the colonial side of the conflict, we often get a one-sided view of events, and that makes it easy for us to forget that the war was fought by two sides. We need to try and understand the perspective of both to get a complete picture of what happened. In any case, while the colonists were preparing for war, the Native Americans were doing the same thing. And then in February of 1676, the fighting started again. On February 29th, Native forces struck the town of Lancaster, Massachusetts. The attack was led by a powerful Native American sachem named Canan, also known as James Printer. A century earlier, his father had been one of the signatories of the first treaty between the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the local tribes. But the young James Printer had no interest in peace. His father had been killed in an altercation with colonists, and the young man wanted revenge. In the raid on Lancaster, he would get it. The town was taken completely by surprise. The alarm was sounded, but there was nowhere to go. The nearest fort was 4 miles away, so the inhabitants barricaded themselves in their houses. But these homes were no match for the attacking force. Homes were set ablaze and destroyed. Livestock was slaughtered and scalped. Men, women, and children were killed, injured, captured, and taken into the wilderness. Among them was a young woman named Mary Rowlandson, who would later publish an influential narrative of her captivity. She and several other women were marched through the burning town, past the bodies of their dead friends and family members, and then taken into the woods. Mary's captivity would last over a year, and she would be forced to march with the Native Americans. As they moved from place to place to avoid the pursuing colonists, her captors included a variety of different tribes, including the Nipmuc, the Mahicans, and the Pete. At one point, she was held captive by a group of Mohegans, but her party was attacked by a rival group of Native Americans, and she was taken once again. The party eventually reached the Connecticut River and then crossed over to the western bank. There they built a village and lived in relative peace for some time. But then the colonists approached and the Native Americans fled. They traveled through the summer heat with little food and water, and many of the captives died during the march. Eventually, they came upon a deserted island in Lake George. They settled there, but soon afterward, an epidemic broke out and even more captives perished. Eventually, the survivors were able to escape or were purchased by traders. Mary Rowlandson was freed on October 18, 1676, and she wasted no time in sharing her story. She published her captivity narrative in 1677, and it was a huge success. It went through 6 editions in the 18th century. Mary's account tells us a lot about how the Native Americans were viewed by the colonists. She writes of the squalid living conditions, the gross food and clothing, and the constant state of hunger and thirst that the captives endured. She describes how the Native Americans performed dances, sing songs, and other rituals that celebrated death and destruction. She also writes of the brutality of the Native Americans, describing them as being bloodthirsty, revengeful, and unmerciful. After the publication of her narrative, Mary became a sort of heroine to the New England colonists. But the reality of her captivity was much more complicated than the story that she told. She doesn't tell us anything about the Native Americans' reasons for waging war, nor does she describe the conditions that led to the captivity of her and others. Furthermore, she glosses over the fact that the Native Americans saved her life on several occasions, and that some of her captors were literate and pious Christians. And while it is true that Mary was treated harshly at times, there were moments when she was treated well. For example, she received presents on several occasions, and when she fell ill, one of her captors carried her on his back for miles. She writes of him, "He proved very tender and careful of me, so much so that if I had not been unwilling to have spoiled his diversion, he would have carried me on his back a great part of the way." When reading her captivity narrative, it is important to remember that Mary wrote this account for an audience of New England colonists who eagerly wanted to hear about the savagery of the Native Americans. So she played up the horror of her experience and downplayed anything that might humanize her captors. Her story served an important purpose in the war effort. She used vivid language to advocate for the killing of Native Americans and the burning of their villages. If her audience was to believe her account, then the only option was to completely destroy the Native Americans. She concludes her narrative with this ringing call to arms. "Oh, that the salvation of the poor prisoners might encourage the present and succeeding generations to join against this common enemy." To drive out or destroy them, that a curse from the rising to the setting sun may fall upon them, and that the impartial judge may finally cut them off. But Mary's story isn't the only source we have for the events of this time period. We also have an account from a Native American named Caleb Cheesy, who fought alongside the colonists. He gives us a very different perspective on events, and I want to read you a passage from his journal. February 1675, 1676. This day being Friday, the 26th of February, about the breaking up of the fast, we heard the alarum bell ring that the Indians had the settlement of Lancaster. Captain Lawrence and Mr. Pemberton went out to see what was the truth of the business. The Indians had given over all, plundering and killing, and had set fire on divers houses, which made the inhabitants flee into the utmost corners of the town. Captain Lawrence rode through the town, calling the inhabitants together to come to Captain Parker's house, where there was a garrison. So they left their houses and followed Captain Lawrence, leaving their goods and their houses to the mercy of the enemy. The foregoing account shows us that the Native Americans didn't just attack and kill indiscriminately. Instead, they strategically targeted homes and buildings that could be used as fortifications. And what can we learn from this? Well, that's right. Just like the Native Americans were trying to win the war and achieve their political goals, the English colonists were too, and that's something that we'll explore further in the next episode. The raids in Lancaster and elsewhere across New England were devastating blows to the colonists, and they understandably wanted revenge. These raids instilled terror across New England. The close-knit communities were torn apart. Families were decimated. Whole towns were burned to the ground. Many of those taken captive never returned home. In the aftermath of the raids, the colonists tried to regroup and launch a counter, and in April, they took their revenge by destroying the Native American town at Bloody Brook. So stay tuned to find out how the colonists avenged the raids of 10. Flames in the next episode. And thank you for watching. The French and Indian War was not going well for the British. By 1758, the British colonies in North America had been pushed back to the coastal regions. Yet somehow the tide would soon turn, and the colonies would begin their slow process of retaking lost ground. So join me today as we look at how the British colonies began their counteroffensive along the frontier. Before we get into the video, if you want to see more videos covering the conflicts in the early Americas, then make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of my uploads. Also, if you want access to some cool tools I use to research and write these videos, then make sure to join my account. In the last episode, we left off with Captain James Ecuyer, leading a force of Rangers and Native Americans through the forests of Pennsylvania in the summer of 1756. Ecuyer was a veteran of the French and Indian War, having previously fought in the Battle of Jomonville Glen. And he was one of the first to realize the value of light infantry tactics and Native American-style warfare in the North American wilderness. As such, he assembled a force of Rangers and Native Scouts to try and harass the French forces in western Pennsylvania. However, while Ecuyer did achieve some success, the larger French and Indian army drove him and his Rangers out of western Pennsylvania by the end of 1756. Though he had been forced to fall back, Ecuyer did have one major victory during this time. And it wasn't until much later that the British realized the importance of what he had done. In August of 1756, while in pursuit of the French and Indians, led by Charles Langlade, came across a group of traders and settlers who had been supplying the colonial militia in the region. Ecuyer ambushed the French, killing or capturing all of them, except for one man who managed to escape to Fort LeBoeuf. The importance of this event would go largely unnoticed for over a year, as it was only after the fact that the British would realize they had just cut off the main supply route to Fort LeBoeuf. This small victory by Captain Ecuyer would actually be the beginning of the end for Fort LeBoeuf, as colonial forces in the region were about to launch a series of attacks that would gradually cut off the fort's supplies and eventually force its surrender. After learning of the defeat of Landaise's detachment, British commanders realized the potential of Ranger warfare, as the forest seemed to be the natural habitat of these light infantry troops. Over the next few years, British forts and trading posts up and down the frontier began training and organizing their own Ranger units. One of the most successful of these early Ranger units was the one created by Virginia Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie. In the fall of 1756, Dinwiddie ordered the creation of a 200-man Ranger fort, which was tasked with harassing the French in Western Virginia, and the force was placed under the command of one of Dinwiddie's most trusted friends, Captain Benjamin Church. What makes Church's Rangers unique is that unlike most other British military forces, They didn't just rely on conventional European tactics. Instead, they also used Native American methods of warfare. For example, they would often travel in small groups, relying on stealth and ambush tactics to attack their opponents. They also wore a distinctive uniform, which was designed to both conceal them in the forest and intimidate their Native American opponents. The uniform consisted of a leather jacket and breeches, a coonskin cap, and a red and white striped waistcoat. Perhaps the most important thing about Church's Rangers was the fact that they employed Native American scouts. These scouts were usually bilingual and bicultural, meaning that they could communicate with and navigate Native American tribes, as well as understand their customs and way of life. During the war, Church's Rangers would conduct several raids against the French in Western Virginia, often in conjunction with Native American allies. One of their most famous raids was the capture of Fort Henry in August of 1756. In July, Church led a force of Rangers and Native Americans to the Kanawha River, where they built a small fort called Camp Cas. From here, they conducted raids against the French, including an attack on Fort Henry. On August 14th, Church's Rangers and Native American allies attacked Fort Henry, forcing the garrison to surrender. This was a significant victory for the British, as it opened up the Ohio Valley to colonial expansion. As the 1750s gave way to the 1760s, Captain Church and his Rangers would continue to harass the French in Western Virginia. And while he wouldn't win any major victories like Fort Henry, he did manage to disrupt French supply lines and prevent them from reinforcing their forts along the frontier. In the meantime, the British began to send regular troops into the Ohio Valley, and this gave colonial leaders the opportunity to start thinking about retaking some of the land they had lost in the early years of the war. By 1760, the British had become aware that the French were becoming increasingly desperate. France itself was being ravaged by the 7 Years' War, and this meant that the French colonial authorities in Canada had less and less to offer their forces in North America. And as such, the British colonial leaders became confident that the time had come to retake the Ohio Valley. Now, this was no easy task, as the French had constructed a series of forts and blockhouses throughout the region that were heavily fortified. But the British had a plan. First, they would cut off the French supply lines, and then they would begin retaking the forts one by one. This process began in 1763 when British naval forces began blockading French ships from entering the Great Lakes. This blockade was effective, as it prevented the French from sending much-needed supplies to their forts and trading posts. At the same time, the British began launching a series of attacks on the French forts. In September of 1763, Fort Le Boeuf fell to a force of British regulars and Rangers, led by Colonel John Armstrong, the fort's commander. Charles Langley surrendered the fort after just 2 days of fighting. Then in October, Fort Pitt, which had been besieged by the French since 1758, finally fell to a relief force of British regulars and provincial troops led by Major General Geoffrey Amherst. These victories were a major blow to the French, as they lost 2 of their most important forts in the Ohio Valley. Yet despite these defeats, the French were still in a position to hold out for at least another year. This was because the British had yet to secure their supply lines. The British were aware of this, however, and they took steps to rectify the situation. In 1764, the British began constructing a series of supply depots along the Ohio River. These depots allowed the British to supply their troops more easily, which made it possible for them to launch more ambitious attacks on the remaining French forts. One of these attacks was the siege of Fort Niagara, which was conducted in 1764 by a British force led by Brigadier General James Abbott. After a month of heavy fighting, the French commander, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, surrendered the fort to the British. With the fall of Fort Niagara, the British had effectively secured the Ohio Valley and had dealt a death blow to the French colonial empire in North America. The French and Indian War had lasted for nearly 10 years, and the British colonies had suffered greatly during that time. The war had resulted in the deaths of thousands of colonists and the destruction of many colonial towns and settlements. But now, in the aftermath of the war, the colonies were beginning to rebuild. The British victory in the war had a profound impact on the future of North America. The French colonial empire in North America had been broken, and this allowed the British colonies to expand westward. However, this expansion would come at a cost, as the British would soon find themselves at war with the very Native Americans, who had helped them to defeat the French. If you want to learn more about how the British would deal with the Native Americans after the war, Then make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video in this series, where we'll cover how the British tried to subjugate the Native Americans. If you enjoyed this video, then please leave a like, so that the algorithm will recommend this video to other people interested in this topic. You can also check out my podcast, No Prig in America, where myself and a co-host cover various topics related to early American history. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Those are Metacom's last stand. Betrayal and death. The year before, when hearing of the impending doom that was following him, Metacom decided he had nothing left to lose. He abandoned his camp at Mount Hope and led what was left of his warriors to the south, to a series of fortified villages built by the Nipmuc people. These villages consisted of large houses, some as long as 100 feet, which were made of thick wooden posts, strong poles, and wet, pliable mud, making them nearly impenetrable to gun and cannon fire. And with the arrival of Metacom and his men, these villages became known as Metacom's castles. For several months, the Colonial militia, under the command of Major General Simon Willard, were unable to dislodge him from these fortifications, and so they turned their attention elsewhere. When scouts finally located Kantaku, now calling himself the Prophet, they brought him back to Boston and hung him as a traitor. They then returned to the south to destroy Metacom's castles once and for all. Though it is important to note that even though the attacks were relentless, Metacom never surrendered, and he refused to abandon his people, even as the fortresses fell one by one. And it was this tenacity that caused the English to become enraged and seek out his head. So let us follow Metacom through these final weeks as we recount his last stand. It was early in the morning on August in 1676, when Metacom stood in the center of his fortress at the base of a hill not far from the Connecticut River. His warriors were gathered around him and he addressed them. They were being attacked by 3 sides, and their ammunition was low. He told them they had 2 options. Either they could fight to the death, or they could flee into the wilderness, where he admitted he would have preferred to do so. But unfortunately, a large party of English soldiers were already pursuing his men, so there would be no escape. Metacom drew his sword and raised it over his head. "We are going to fight," he declared, "and every man must fight today like a man." Then, with a war cry, he led his men out of the fortress and into battle. Amongst those who followed Metacom that day was his brother, Caleb, also called Wamsuta, along with 2 of his sons and many of his warriors. The English forces were led by Captains John Treat and Thomas Major General Willard. Did not personally participate in this battle, despite being present at the siege, because he had recently been wounded. When the 2 armies met, the Native Americans fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. But the English had superior numbers, and within only a few minutes of the commencement of hostilities, Caleb and one of his sons had fallen, killed by English muskets. Another of Metacom's sons was taken captive, but not before he stabbed his captor and killed him. Metacom avenged his brother's death by killing the man who was responsible for it. But throughout it all, the English continued to press their attack, forcing Metacom and his men further and further back. By now, they were completely out of ammunition, and so it became a fight with knives and tomahawks, and a battle to the death ensued. During the course of the fighting, Metacom killed several English soldiers, but eventually he found himself alone, surrounded by his enemies. According to one version of events, as he stood there fighting, someone in the throng of Englishmen recognized him and shouted, "There is the great Sachem. Come and see him here. Here he is." And so they closed in and hacked him to pieces. His head was cut off and left dangling from a rope as the English soldiers rode back towards their camp. They had won. However, there is another version of events. After slaying so many of his foes, Metacom collapsed from exhaustion and wounds, and died standing. A missionary named John Eliot claimed that when he arrived at the scene, he saw Metacom lying on the ground, still breathing. He said, "I went up to him and asked him if he would give me his hand. He gave me his hand, and I shook it, and when I felt his pulse, I found he was alive yet. I asked him again if he would speak to me, and he answered, 'I have nothing to say.' And after that, he breathed out his soul. Whatever actually happened, the end result was the same. Metacom was dead. His head was severed from his body and hung from the bowsprit of the ship that had brought Governor Phipps to Mass. It would remain there until the next spring, when it was chopped down and buried in an unmarked grave. But what was Metacom thinking as he faced his executioners? How did he feel? As he looked upon his decimated army, was he filled with regret, anger, sadness? Unfortunately, we cannot know, but his vision, however, shines a light on his thoughts and gives us insight into the mind of a leader who fought against impossible odds, who tried to save his people from annihilation and preserve their way of life. In late November of 1675, just weeks before his demise, Metacom spoke to a group of Christianized Indians who visited him at night, fearing to be seen during daylight because of the hostility that existed between them and the colonists. He explained to them why he was waging war, telling them he wished to leave his children a homeland. "My desire," he said, "is only to leave my children something more than the wilderness, to provide for themselves, that they may not be forced to go into the wilderness to live by hunting and gathering of food, which is hard and laborious, or to live with the white people in towns, which is full of snares." He was attempting to forge a path between two dangerous extremes, one of extinction in the wilderness, the other of complete cultural assimilation in the towns. He wanted his people to survive. He envisioned a coexistence between the natives and the colonists, a relationship based on mutual respect and cooperation. Metacom dreamed of a nation where Indians and Europeans could coexist peacefully and share the land. And while his dream did not come true, his efforts should not be forgotten. He showed courage, determination, and ingenuity throughout his life, and especially during the war. He adapted to new circumstances and used whatever means necessary to achieve his goals. This is evidenced by his use of diplomacy, military tactics, and guerrilla warfare, as well as his ability to forge alliances with other tribes and nations. Metacom was a visionary leader who tried to chart a new course for his people. He attempted to bridge the cultural divide between the Native Americans and the colonists, and sought to establish a nation where both could thrive. While his dream was ultimately crushed, his legacy lives on in the struggle for Native American rights and recognition. As we conclude our account of Metacom's life, we are left with a sense of admiration for this great leader. He was a warrior, a statesman, and a visionary who fought for the survival of his people. We hope that his story will serve as an inspiration to all who strive for justice and equality in the face of oppression. Throughout this series, we have examined the rise of Metacom and the factors that led to his leadership of the Native American tribes in New England. We have witnessed his military prowess as he led his people in a valiant struggle for freedom and independence. We have seen his political acumen as he forged alliances with other tribes and nations in an effort to unite the Native Americans against the colonial threat. And we have admired his vision of a future where Native Americans and colonists could live together in peace and harmony. Unfortunately, Metacom's vision was not shared by the colonists, and he was ultimately defeated and killed. But his story does not end there. His legacy lives on in the hearts and minds of Native Americans and all who admire his courage and determination. Metacom's life and death serve as a reminder of the importance of fighting for what is right, no matter how difficult the odds may seem. He was a true hero who sacrificed everything for his people and his cause. As we remember him today, let us also recommit ourselves to the pursuit of justice and equality for all. Let us strive to create a world where the dream of peace and harmony between peoples is realized. A world where Metacom's vision can finally be fulfilled. And now, back to our World War II timeline. Number 13. Shattered Worlds. By the end of hostilities, somewhere between 5 and 7% of New England's entire population would be dead. Most of them civilians. Entire towns were burned to the ground and countless family farms were devastated by fire or neglect. In fact, the state of Maine suffered the greatest proportional loss of life of any state in the conflict, with an estimated 28% of its men killed in action. It was a profound demographic catastrophe that left an indelible scar on the region. Families were torn apart and thousands of children were orphaned. Women were left to manage households alone, shouldering the burden of cooking, cleaning, and farm work, while also caring for their children and livestock. Towns like Deerfield were decimated. In 1704, the town had a population of around 500 people, but after the war, only 46 survived. Well, this is an extreme example. The war's impact on New England towns varied widely. Some, like Charleston, were completely wiped out. Others, like Deerfield, suffered severe population losses. Many more experienced significant damage to their homes and businesses. As an illustration, let's take the town of Coventry. Before the war, Coventry was a thriving community with around 150 families. But following the conflict, Only 11 families returned to the town, which had been largely abandoned. The aftermath of the war left many towns in a state of desolation. Their populations dwindled, and their futures uncertain. However, amidst the ashes of these towns, seeds of resilience were sown. Communities began to rebuild, though not without their scars. They pulled themselves up from the rubble, determined to restore their lives and their towns. Despite the magnitude of their losses, they showed remarkable tenacity in the face of adversity. But it wasn't just about bricks and mortars. It was about rekindling hope in a region that had been through unimaginable horrors. And so they did. They cleared the debris, they erected new buildings, and they re-established schools and businesses. This was not an easy task. The economic toll of the war was immense. The war had devastated New England's economy. The cost of rebuilding, coupled with the loss of life and property, left many families struggling to make ends meet. Fields were abandoned, livestock were lost, and businesses were ruined. The once vibrant economy of the region was now in sharp decline. But the people of New England were not daunted. They understood that the path to recovery would be long and arduous, but they were committed to their towns and to each other. They rolled up their sleeves and got to work. They cleared the wreckage, they planted new crops, and they reopened their businesses. Their determination to rebuild was unwavering. As they surveyed the damage around them, they knew that the road to recovery would be long and challenging. Homes and businesses lay in ruins. Fields were abandoned, and the laughter of children had been replaced by an eerie silence. But amidst the despair, there was a glimmer of hope. As the sun rose over the ravaged landscape, the people of New England began to stir. They emerged from their shelters, their faces etched with grief and determination. They were a resilient lot. These New Englanders, they had faced hardship before, but never had it been so dire. They began to assess the damage, the full extent of which would not be known for weeks. Homes were burnt to the ground. Businesses were destroyed, and the faces of their loved ones, some they would never see again. But even in the darkest of times, the human spirit finds a way to endure. These men and women, many of them farmers, had always been accustomed to hard work. So as the shock of the war began to fade, they rolled up their sleeves and got to work. They cleared the debris, they planted crops, and they cared for their livestock. Life had to go on. Families had to be fed, and the towns had to be rebuilt. There were births, there were marriages, and there were deaths. Life ebbed and flowed despite the shadow of war that still loomed large over New England. As the years passed, the wounds of war began to heal. The towns began to thrive once more. Schools were rebuilt, businesses reopened, and the sounds of laughter and industry filled the streets once again. The memory of those who had fallen was honored, and the stories of their bravery were passed down through generations. But the scars of war remained, not just in the hearts of the people, but in the very fabric of their society. The war had brought profound changes to New England. The pre-war social order had been shattered and a new era was dawning. In the aftermath of the war, New England grappled with profound social, political, and economic changes that would shape its future. One of the most immediate impacts of the war was the emotional toll it took on the survivors. Thousands of families were torn apart during the conflict. Men where lost wives were widowed and children were orphaned. The psychological scars of this loss ran deep, casting a long shadow over the region's psyche. Communities were left grappling with profound grief, struggling to come to terms with the magnitude of their losses. The sense of community was profoundly affected as traditional social structures were broken down and people were forced to rely on one another for support and survival. The bonds forged in the crucible of war would become an integral part of their collective memory. The outbreak of hostilities saw many young men leave their families and their homes to take up arms. These men, many of whom were farmers and tradesmen, were torn from their daily routines and thrust into the harsh realities of war. They left behind wives and children, parents and siblings, and marched off to the front lines. These goodbyes were not the joyful partings one might associate with military service today. They were fraught with uncertainty, knowing that they may never return. Families huddled together, tears streaming down their faces as they said their final goodbyes, never imagining the horrors that awaited them. The return of these men, when it did happen, was often met with joy, but also a sobering realization. They had all changed. The war had stripped them bare, both physically and emotionally, leaving them forever marked by their experiences. Meanwhile, on the home front, women shouldered the burden of keeping their families and communities afloat. They managed households, farms, and businesses in the absence of men who had gone to war. They took on traditionally male roles, operating farm machinery, managing finances, and even fighting in disguised clothing. They exhibited remarkable strength and resilience, proving that they were capable of managing not just domestic duties, but also the heavy responsibilities thrust upon them by the war. But this was not without its challenges. They faced societal expectations, prejudice, and the constant fear of losing their men to the conflict. Yet they persevered, ensuring the survival and continuity of their families and communities. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this conflict was the fate of the children caught in the crossfire. Many were orphaned, separated from their parents, either by death or the chaos of war. They found themselves alone in a world that had turned upside down, their innocence shattered by the harsh realities of the conflict. Some were taken in by relatives or neighbors, while others were left to fend for themselves on the streets. The sight of these lost souls wandering through the war-torn landscapes became a poignant symbol of the human cost of war. The disruption caused by the war extended far beyond the battlefield. Education was significantly impacted as schools were closed and teachers were called to serve in the military or take on other essential roles. The education of a generation was put on hold, leaving children with limited access to formal schooling. This not only affected their academic development, but also left them ill-prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. It was a setback that would have lasting consequences on the intellectual and economic prospects of the region. Life in New England after the war was a stark reminder of the profound impact of the conflict. The landscape was forever changed. The people had endured unimaginable hardships, and the innocence of their children was lost. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded, they were left to pick up the pieces and rebuild their lives. The cost of war, measured not just in material losses, but also in the erosion of innocence and the fracturing of communities, became a heavy burden for the region to bear. And on that somber note, we bring this episode to a close. If you enjoyed this episode and want to learn more about the lesser-known conflicts in our past, please hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to support us further, consider becoming a patron. Your support allows us to continue bringing these important historical tales to light. Thanks for watching. Stay curious, and I'll catch you in the next one. Chanta 14. The Fate of Nations. Native Displacement and Colonial Ascendancy. The Fate of Nations. Native Displacement and Colonial Ascendancy. The year is 1763. For the past 7 years, the world's greatest empire has been at war with two of the most powerful nations in Europe. Through a combination of luck, skill, and treachery, they have managed to defeat both of them. And now their enemies are suing for peace. Soon, the victorious nation will celebrate their many triumphs across 3 continents, but also take stock of the human cost of all that killing. Perhaps they might consider this when they sit down to write the next chapter of their glorious history. Meanwhile, somewhere far away, a small group of people are clinging to life in the shadow of disease and starvation. Others have been captured and enslaved by the very people who had hunted their ancestors for generations, and still others are lucky enough to be alive, though some will carry the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives. These stories are the fate of nations. When the Iroquois Confederacy first encountered Europeans in the early 1600s, they were living in relative peace. In fact, they had spent much of the 17th century expanding their territory, population, and political influence. But then, everything changed. In 1722, a French explorer named Nicolas de Bonaventure and his party paddled up to an Onondaga village and demanded that they surrender their prisoners. The Onondaga refused, so the French killed 4 of their hostages and forced the tribe to choose between 2 horrible options. They could either release the remaining prisoners, or the French would kill them all. The Onondaga chose to release the prisoners, which included several missionaries, one of whom would later write about the incident. This was not what the Iroquois were used to. For centuries, they had lived by the great law of peace. Now, however, they were being forced to choose between killing innocent people and letting murderers go free. So instead, they did something completely out of character for them. They went to war. Over the next few decades, they fought many battles against the French and their Native American allies. But although the Iroquois had some victories, it soon became clear that they couldn't win a war against such powerful enemies. So in 1757, they tried to switch to a different strategy. That year, the Iroquois delegation traveled to Albany, New York, where they met with representatives from the British colonies. They wanted to join the British in their conflict with France, and together they could fight more effectively. Unfortunately, the British weren't interested in an alliance. They offered the Iroquois a deal: abandon your villages and move west of the Appalachian Mountains forever. Most of the tribes refused, but in 1762, after suffering many defeats, the Mohawks finally agreed. They packed up what little they could carry, burned the rest, and walked away from their ancestral lands. Soon, the British would defeat the French and force them to give up all of their territory east of the Mississippi. With their enemies gone, the British didn't need the Iroquois anymore, so they turned on them. Entire villages were destroyed, and thousands of Iroquois were sold into slavery, some as far away as the Caribbean. The British had won the war, but at what cost? Well, that depends on what you value more, land or people. In terms of land, the victory was massive. The Treaty of Paris ceded all of France's territories east of the Mississippi to the British, and those territories were huge. They contained modern-day Canada, the United States, and most of Mexico. In addition, the British received Florida from Spain. Altogether, the British Empire had gained more than 2 million square miles of territory in North America alone. To put that in perspective, if you laid it out flat, it would stretch from California to eastern Turkey. In other words, the British Empire was now the largest in the world. But what about people? Well, unfortunately, the number of people living in the British Empire would actually decrease as a result of the war. At the start of the French and Indian War, there were about 20,000 European colonists in North America. But by the end, that number had dropped to 17,000. Similarly, the Native American population declined from around 1 million to just 800,000. So Britain may have gained more land, but they lost hundreds of thousands of subjects in the process. For the Native Americans, the loss was even greater. During the war, the Iroquois Confederacy was the only major Native American alliance to side with the British, and they did so for a variety of reasons. First, they hated the French. The French had made slaves of their people and killed countless others. Then there was the example of the Huron, a Native American tribe in present-day Canada. They had sided with the French during the war, and now they were paying the price. As one British officer wrote, the whole body of them were carried into captivity, and not above 200 were permitted to return. Finally, the Iroquois realized that their way of life was under attack. Diseases brought over by Europeans had already devastated their populations. In addition, settlers were encroaching on their land and competing with them for resources. So when the British asked for their support, the Iroquois decided to join them. They hoped that by doing so, they could save their people and their way of life. Instead, they would lose both. The vast majority of Iroquois villages were destroyed, and tens of thousands of their people were killed or taken captive. It was a catastrophe, but it wasn't unique. All across North America, Native Americans were suffering the same fate. By the end of the war, around 60,000 of them would die. Now, in most wars, casualties like that would be cause for celebration, but not here. There were simply too many people involved in the conflict for the victors to make use of all those corpses, and so instead of celebrating, they had to deal with the aftermath. Thousands of Native Americans had been taken captive during the war, and once the fighting stopped, the British had to decide what to do with them. Some of them were ransomed back to their tribes for large amounts of money. Others were given to the colonists to be used as indentured servants. Still others were sent to England to be sold at auction. The situation was so dire that one colonist wrote it is no uncommon thing for a man to purchase a child for 30 or 40 pounds, and to agree to pay down 1/4 part of the purchase money to the Indians, and the remainder in provisions for the child. Even worse, many of the captives were young children who were ripped away from their families and forced to live among strangers. Sometimes they were treated well, but often they were not. One former captive recalled his treatment at the hands of his captors. They beat me every day and often tied me up and left me without vital. And when I came to them, they would use me worse than any other slave. Eventually, the British government realized that the captives were not a financial asset, but rather a burden. So they started shipping them off to places like Bermuda and the Caribbean, where they could be used as labor. In total, thousands of Native Americans would be sold into slavery, some never to be heard from again. So in the end, who really won the war? After all, the British had taken more land and defeated two powerful enemies. But at what cost? Tens of thousands of Native Americans were dead, and the survivors were scattered and traumatized. In addition, the war had been expensive. It had cost the British around £100 million, or the modern equivalent of about $20 billion. And even though they had gained more land, it wasn't like they could collect taxes from anyone living there. In fact, for many years, the British government actually lost money on its North American colonies. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that they started to turn a profit. So the war may have been a military victory for the British, but it wasn't a financial one. Nevertheless, the war did set the stage for further colonial ascendancy, because the British were now in control of almost all of North America. This meant that they could focus on building their empire without worrying about outside interference. In addition, the war had killed or removed most of the Native American population, which meant that the British had less competition for land and resources. Finally, the war had crippled France as a colonial power. This meant that the British no longer had a rival in North America, and they would hunt for many years to come. As a result, the British Empire was now free to expand across the continent. In fact, over the next few decades, the British would fight several wars with Spain in order to acquire more territory. They would also send explorers and traders into the western frontier, where they would encounter all sorts of new people and things. For example, in 1770, British explorer James Cook landed in Australia and claimed it for the British Empire. A few years later, he would circumnavigate New Zealand and chart the coast of what would become known as Hawaii. Meanwhile, British traders were venturing into the heart of Africa in search of slaves. By the end of the 18th century, the British Empire would stretch from one side of the Atlantic Ocean to the other. And it was all thanks to the wars with France and Native Americans. To learn more about the French and Indian War, stay tuned for more information. And then there were none. Well, actually that's not quite true. There is at least one person still around from King Philip's War. This is old Mr. Canoe, Amashpi Wampanoag, man who was born in 1923. He was one of the last speakers of the language, and although he doesn't speak much anymore, he still tells stories. He tells stories about what happened here all those years ago, before there were any records, before there was anything but memories. Memories that only Canoe and a few others carry now. In Chapter 14, we looked at the accounts written by Puritans in the aftermath of the war. Works like Increase Mathers and Cotton Mathers, The Wonders of the Lord. They wrote of a God-ordained victory for the Puritan colonists over the heathen South. In the end, they said, the Lord did so that his holy word might be made good, but there are no Wampanoag or Nipmuc survivors to tell their side of the story. Or are there? Well, after King Philip's death, the accounts of his war were taken up by the 19th century romantics. They wove the tales of the heroic Native Americans into their own narratives of an untamed wilderness and a noble, tragic foe. This perspective romanticized the Native Americans, portraying them as noble, yet doomed, victims of white American expansionism. It celebrated King Philip as a kind of tragic hero and used his death as emblematic of the passing of an era. But it also helped solidify stereotypes of the Native Americans as uniformly good and pure, the noble savage. The problem is, there never really was a uniform Native American experience. The tribes here were not all alike. They had different languages, cultures, governments. Most importantly, they had different relationships with the colonists. To think of them all as allies united against an encroaching evil ignores that fact. It reduces the story to a simple Manichaean narrative where everyone on one side is good and everyone on the other side is bad. And of course, there's more to the story than that. We know now that during the war, some Native Americans allied themselves with the Puritans, fighting alongside them against other Native Americans. Others took no part in the war at all. Instead, they tried to stay neutral, hoping to maintain good relations with both sides. Some even fought for the Native American side, but not for King Philip. They fought for Metacom, its brother, Cananche. Cananche was the sachem of the Nipmuc people. He was a powerful leader in this region, but he didn't want war. He wanted to stay neutral, trading peacefully with the English, while defending his land from other tribes. So these diverse perspectives and experiences have been largely erased from memory, lost to time, written out of history. But here at Old Sturbridge Village, we're trying to bring them back. We're doing our best to weave them back into the fabric of the story. We can't do everything. We don't have the resources or expertise to make these voices heard in their full context, but we can help draw attention to them. We can point visitors toward resources that share their stories in greater detail, and we can create new programs that center Native American perspectives. We've done a few things already. Last year, we partnered with the Wampanoag tribe to put up these panels, which reflect on the use of indigenous land. We're working on new exhibits about the war that will open here next year, and we've commissioned an artist to create a sculpture of Metacom's brother, Canonicus, a man whose story has never been told until now. But this is just a beginning. I mentioned Increase Mather's book, The Wonders of the Lord. Well, if you look through his text, you'll find an account of a day in 1675, when the Colonial militia captured a Native American woman named Tiger. She was a Christian convert who lived among the Brain Indians at Metacom, Massachusetts. Her story is harrowing. She was tortured to get her to renounce her faith. Then she was burned alive. Now, imagine you're a young girl growing up here in New England. You're learning about King Philip's War from your teacher, hearing for the first time about this brave woman who died rather than betray her God. And you ask, where can I learn more about her? Where can I learn more about other Native Americans like her? Your teacher should be able to answer that question. She should know that the Wampanoag have a museum with exhibits about their people's history. She should know to direct you to the library's online catalog, which has books about Native Americans in New England. Books written by Native Americans. But if your teacher grew up here in New England 100 years ago, she may not know much about the Mashpee, and if she does, she may not feel comfortable directing you to those resources, because these stories aren't always easy to hear. They challenge us to confront painful truths about ourselves and our history. One of those truths is that sometimes we don't know how to listen. Sometimes we don't listen at all. We don't listen to each other or to the lessons the past offers us. And when we don't listen, we repeat the mistakes of the past. Tiger's story isn't just part of King Philip's War. It's part of a long history of religious intolerance, a history we continue to grapple with today. When people come to the village, they often ask me why we remember this war at all. What can we learn from it? Well, we can learn about ourselves, what we're capable of, but also what we aspire to be. We can learn how to honor the dead by remembering the stories we choose to tell. We can make sure that in telling the story, we don't forget anyone. As the playwright and director Peter Shaffer once wrote, the purpose of memorial is not to keep the dead alive, but to live in the shadow of the dead. That means learning about those who came before us, understanding their hopes and dreams and fears and prejudices, understanding the world they lived in and how it shaped them. It also means understanding the ways that we have failed to understand each other. During the war, Puritan leaders claimed that their conflict was a holy war, ordained by God himself. They wrote of King Philip as the Antichrist, said that their cause was righteous, that they were fighting for the Lord. But what did that mean? The Bible says, an eye for an eye. It calls for an eye to be put out. Did God really want that? Was this really the path to righteousness? Not according to Jesus, who turned the other cheek and preached turning the other heart. We're called to remember, but we're also called to forgive. Forgiving is hard. It doesn't mean forgetting or excusing. It means acknowledging wrong and choosing to move forward without bitterness. It's a difficult path, one we rarely walk alone, but it's a lesson worth learning. We need only look to the saints, those rare individuals who managed to embody the teachings of Jesus, to show us the way. In October of 1675, when King Philip was dead and the war was winding down, a group of Puritans gathered at the home of John Eliot, their minister. They wanted to hear a sermon, something to lift their spirits after a brutal and bloody conflict. Eliot preached to them about peace. He said that the only way the colonists would ever have peace with the Native Americans was to love one another. That was the only way to have lasting peace, to love one another. We're a long way from Eliot's vision of peace in our father's world. When you visit the village, you'll see replicas of the homes, shops, and meeting house that Eliot knew. He built the first of these structures in the 1640s. Eliot was one of the earliest settlers in this area. His life spanned much of the 17th century, and he witnessed many changes. He saw the colony grow from a struggling outpost to a thriving community. He watched it go from a refuge for persecuted Puritans to a society that persecuted others. In the end, he left us with a challenge. He showed us the way to peace and reminded us that we must love one another. He knew that peace is a fragile thing, that it needs tending. He knew that the path to peace begins with understanding and respect. Thank you for listening to my reflections on the lessons we can learn from King Philip's War. If you'd like to learn more about what life was like during the time period, check out our website. And if you'd like to support the work we do here at Old Sturbridge Village, be sure to join our membership program. Together, we can keep the stories of the past alive for future generations.